In the autumn of 1939, shortly after the beginning of the war, German troops entered Krakow. The city, once lively and noisy, sank into an atmosphere of fear and subjugation. New signs appeared on the streets, new decrees, curfews. The life that local residents once knew disappeared. In those days, a man whose name meant nothing at the time arrived in the city, an industrialist and member of the Nazi Party named Oskar Schindler. Born in Moravia, Schindler was not a fanatic. His past was marked more by commercial instinct than ideology. He was a man skilled at adapting, seeking profit, and finding opportunity where others saw only risk. He came to Krakow with the intention of doing business in a newly occupied territory where the German authorities actively encouraged entrepreneurs, especially those able to supply the army's needs. Soon after his arrival, he acquired an abandoned enamelware factory, a plant that had belonged to Jewish owners who were no longer permitted to run businesses. The factory received a new name, Deutsche Emalwarenfabrik, or DEF for short. On paper, it looked like a successful example of German initiative. But behind the facade lay another reality. The workers were mainly Jews from the Krakow ghetto, forced there as part of resettlement policies. Schindler quickly realized that cheap labor and contracts with the Wehrmacht promised enormous profit. He began receiving orders for enamel pots and kitchenware for military use. Outwardly, everything fit the party line. A German entrepreneur, contributing to the Reich's economy, discipline, and order. Yet, as the occupation grew increasingly brutal, Schindler began to see what he had not seen before. Each day, new decrees arrived in the city. Jews were required to wear identifying badges, move only with permission, and their homes were subject to constant searches. They walked from the factory to the ghetto on foot under escort, and from the ghetto back to the factory through checkpoints, where any mistake could cost a life. Watching this, Schindler grew increasingly aware that the power he cooperated with was not merely a military machine, but a system of extermination. By 1941, Krakow had become the administrative center of the general government. The liquidation of small businesses began, and resettlements intensified. In March 1941, the Krakow ghetto was created, a place where more than 15,000 people were confined within a small area. Schindler was granted permission to keep his workers and began petitioning for each one of them, claiming that without their labor the factory could not fulfill military contracts. At that stage, his actions could still be interpreted as pragmatic. Jewish workers cost less than Polish or German employees, and replacing them risked halting production. Yet gradually, his motives began to change. Schindler saw his workers lose their families and vanish one by one. He realized that a piece of paper, a stamp, a signature, these were all that separated life from death. The system of documents, lists, and permits became the core instrument of power. And it was within this system that Schindler began to search for cracks. His connections with the administration, his ability to persuade, give gifts, and sometimes bribes allowed him to bend the rules. He became a master of bureaucratic deception, but not for profit, rather for the people he had come to see as his own. In those months, the factory transformed into something more than an industrial site. It became a refuge, a hidden zone where people could feel a trace of life. Beneath the sound of machinery and the clang of hammers lay the silence of fear, and only thanks to one signature on a sheet of paper did each worker have a chance to see the next day. By 1942, Schindler had become known among German officials as a man of influence. He was often seen at receptions, in restaurants, among SS officers. But behind this facade, his secret game continued, complex, risky, and deadly. He understood that any suspicion, any inspection, could lead to arrest, and everything he had built would collapse in a single day. As repression grew stronger, Schindler strengthened his factory of life, step by step. Hundreds of Jews worked there, each registered in official documents as an essential specialist. Fake job titles, fabricated professions, carefully written reports all became his weapons against a merciless system. He did not yet know that the coming years would force him to fight for every life as for his own. But already in the cold days of 1942, among the echoes of sirens and the hum of machines, the first outlines of what would later be called Schindler's List were taking shape. By the spring of 1942, Krakow had changed completely. On the outskirts of the city, in the Podgórze district, construction of the ghetto was completed. The walls, shaped like tombstones, became a grim symbol of the time. Inside this confined space lived tens of thousands of people. Every day, new families were forced in, relocated from other neighborhoods. The space grew smaller, and life lost its familiar shape. The city now existed in two realities. Beyond the ghetto walls, ordinary life, continued shops, trams, German officers walking along clean streets. Inside, hunger, disease, and fear ruled. The authorities declared that Jews would be provided with work and food, but in reality, that meant only one thing: survival had become a privilege. Only those who held official labor permits, the Arbeitskarte, had a chance to live. Oskar Schindler's factory, officially registered as a military supplier, received permission to employ workers from the ghetto. The lists compiled in his office became passes to life. People were selected carefully: men, women, teenagers, anyone able to hold a tool. Each document, each card, had a value measured not in money, but in the time a person could still remain alive. With every passing month, administrative demands grew stricter. Inspections followed one another. Any inconsistency in paperwork could lead to the dissolution of the enterprise. Schindler understood that, officially, his factory was a part of the Reich's war economy. Yet, in reality, it was becoming a refuge. He used every opportunity to expand his workforce, adding fictional positions: boiler inspector, enamel specialist, quality controller. The workers knew their lives depended on a piece of paper signed by the director. For many, Schindler's name became a symbol of protection, though no one knew what truly motivated him. Among German officials, he was seen as a successful entrepreneur, shrewd, calculating, and ambitious. He stayed visible, attended social events, entertained officers, gave gifts, and used every connection to secure new permits. Meanwhile, life inside the ghetto was becoming unbearable. Food supplies were cut, restrictions multiplied. In June 1942, the first mass deportations began. Actions, as they were described in official reports. People were gathered in squares, divided into groups. Some were sent to labor camps. Others vanished without trace. Schindler's factory became one of the few places that could protect someone from deportation. Schindler saw these events with his own eyes. His pass allowed him to move freely between the ghetto and the city. He watched columns of people disappear beyond the gates, leaving behind apartments, photographs, and fragments of their lives. Gradually, he stopped turning away when he heard screams. His cold, businesslike rationality was replaced by growing unease. With the help of his accountant, Itzhak Stern, Schindler organized a system of false employment records, allowing more people to be added to the factory's workforce than officially permitted. The papers were signed, stamped, and sent to the authorities perfect on the surface, but built entirely on deception. By the autumn of 1942, the factory had become a place of rescue not only for workers but for their families. Sometimes people without papers were smuggled in and hidden as employees. Schindler understood he was risking everything: his business, his freedom, his life. But he continued, knowing that behind bureaucratic language like production necessity lay the only form of protection possible in that world. The ghetto was turning into a trap. The walls that once served as boundaries now marked the approach of the end. Outside stood patrols. Inside reigned orders and violence. Schindler knew his connections within the SS offered only temporary safety. Each new signature, each updated list, was a move in a dangerous game that could end at any moment. Still, his reputation grew. Officials saw him as useful, officers as generous, partners as reliable. He used that image as a shield. Beneath the surface of a prosperous industrialist, he continued his quiet resistance, turning bureaucracy into a tool for life. By the winter of 1942, Krakow froze under snow and hunger. Yet behind the gates of Schindler's factory, work went on. The hum of machines, the ringing of metal, the steady rhythm of labor all masked the fragile heartbeat of survival. While the world outside descended into darkness, inside those walls, people still breathed, hoping that as long as their names appeared on the list, they might live to see another dawn. The factory of Oskar Schindler had become more than an enterprise. It was an island of human existence in a world collapsing around it. Its walls hid not just machinery, but the last remaining spark of hope. And no one yet could imagine how high the price of that hope would be. In the spring of 1943, Krakow lived in anxious expectation. Over the winter, inspections within the ghetto had increased, and rumors spread about its imminent liquidation. People hid documents, changed addresses, and sought connections that could offer even the smallest chance to avoid deportation. In early March, the official order came. City authorities announced that the ghetto would be reorganized. To those living outside, it sounded like administrative language. To those inside, it meant the end. On the morning of 12 March 1943, the liquidation began. At dawn, the streets filled with trucks, soldiers, and officers. Residents were driven out of their homes and assembled into columns. Some were sent to the Plazo labor camp, others disappeared forever. Shouts, gunfire, and the rumble of engines merged into a single noise that echoed through the city. Krakow watched as an entire part of itself ceased to exist. Schindler was inside the ghetto that day. His pass allowed him to be there officially under the pretext of verifying his workers' lists. He saw the streets where his laborers had lived turn into ruins. Curtains fluttered in broken windows, papers and children's toys scattered across the cobblestones. He understood that direct intervention was impossible. Any action could mean arrest or execution. But he still had one weapon paper. That same day, he compiled new lists of workers, adding the names of those who had not been officially employed but worked at the factory informally. Every document was signed by him personally, filled with neutral phrases such as essential for production or technical equipment specialist. In the bureaucratic world of the Reich, those words carried weight. When the ghetto ceased to exist, part of the surviving workers was transferred to the Plazo camp. The camp was built near the factory, on the site of a former Jewish cemetery. It became a new center of forced labor under SS control. Conditions were brutal, and the guards were known for their cruelty. Schindler realized that the lives of his workers now depended not only on paperwork, but on his ability to deal with the camp's command. He began building a careful relationship with the officers. Gifts, dinners, money, everything served a purpose. Outwardly, it looked like diplomacy. In reality, it was survival. He managed to arrange for some workers to be brought daily from Plazo to his factory and back. In reports, this was justified as an economic necessity. Trained workers could not be replaced by unskilled labor. Every morning, a column of people walked from the camp to the factory gates. Their faces showed exhaustion and fear. Guards checked the lists, and any discrepancy could mean death. Schindler was always present, controlling the process personally. He maintained an image of a meticulous German industrialist concerned with order. Beneath that mask lay the desire to prevent even one name from being crossed out. The factory became a zone apart. Violence was forbidden. Extra food was issued, and warm clothing distributed. Officially, it was to maintain productivity. In truth, it was a fragile shield of dignity in a world of degradation. The Plazow camp grew larger. Prisoners arrived daily from across Krakow and surrounding towns. The conditions were unbearable, and death was constant. Amid this despair, Schindler's factory stood as a fragment of stability, a place where life, however limited, still existed. By the summer of 1943, he was no longer motivated by profit. He had become part of the struggle to preserve human lives. He understood that his factory was a thin line between life and annihilation, and each day might be his last. In the autumn of 1943, a new commander took charge of Plazow SS officer Amon Goeth, a man known for his ruthlessness. His presence turned the camp into a place of terror. Schindler knew he now faced his most dangerous challenge. To protect his workers, he would have to convince Goeth that the factory was indispensable to the Reich's war effort. Krakow lived under the rumble of war, but in the shadow of Schindler's factory chimneys, a small fragment of humanity persisted, maintained by deception, bribery, and fragile hope. No one could foresee that the choices made there would one day define one of the most remarkable acts of courage in modern history. In the winter of 1943, the Plazow camp became one of the largest centers of forced labor in the general government. It was commanded by SS officer Amon Goeth, a man whose name quickly became a symbol of terror. Built on the grounds of a former cemetery, the camp resembled a city of death. Barracks, watchtowers, fences, and administrative buildings stood in grim order, all ruled by Goeth's unpredictable will. Schindler, observing this reality, understood that his previous methods no longer sufficed. Goeth was volatile and impulsive, capable of killing on a whim. To protect his workers, Schindler needed a new strategy, a careful game of persuasion and control. Direct opposition was impossible. The only chance lay in manipulation, to convince Goeth that the factory was indispensable to the war economy. He began to visit the camp regularly, bringing documents, reports, and gifts. Officially, these were business visits. In reality, they were efforts to build personal trust. Schindler hosted dinners, supplied rare goods, alcohol, and cigars, small luxuries that appealed to the camp commander. Goeth interpreted these gestures as signs of respect. Schindler saw them as investments in human lives. Each morning, a column of workers marched from Plazow to the factory. Their faces were pale, their steps heavy. At the gate, guards checked the names against printed lists. Any error could mean death. Schindler always stood nearby, overseeing the process with an expression of strict professionalism. He appeared as a disciplined industrialist, demanding order. Beneath that mask, he was fighting to ensure that no one disappeared from the roster. Inside the factory, the rules were different. Violence was forbidden, and food rations were higher than in the camp. Warm clothing and small privileges were given out. Officially, this was justified by the need to maintain productivity. In truth, it was a fragile sanctuary, a pocket of humanity amid an empire of fear. Meanwhile, Plazow grew even larger. Prisoners were brought from across the region. Death became routine. Schindler knew he could not change the system, but he could bend it at its edges. He continued to bribe officials, falsify records, and quietly expand his list of employees. In his office, under the guise of administrative work, he conducted a war against bureaucracy itself. By the spring of 1944, the situation grew more dangerous. Inspections intensified. The SS began verifying employment lists to identify fake names. Schindler stayed awake at night, correcting records, removing inconsistencies, creating new signatures. His work was not measured in production numbers, but in human lives preserved on paper. He understood that what he was doing was treason against the regime, but his conscience no longer allowed passivity. he had crossed the invisible line between complicity and resistance. Each act of deception, every forged report, became a deliberate challenge to the system of death. The Plasso camp embodied the destruction of humanity under total control. Yet within that darkness stood Schindler's factory, a place where machinery drowned out despair and the rhythm of labor concealed the rhythm of survival. He knew it could not last. The war was shifting, and with it came new orders that would soon threaten everything he had built. By the summer of 1944, the war had turned. The German army was retreating, and the front was moving rapidly toward Poland. For the prisoners of Plasso, this did not mean liberation. Quite the opposite, an order was issued to liquidate the camp. All inmates were to be transported west, deeper into German territory. Rumors spread quickly, and people understood that these transports meant almost certain death. Oskar Schindler learned of the order early. His factory in Krakow was still operating, but supplies were delayed, materials were scarce, and production was losing importance to the war effort. He realized that at any moment the factory could be shut down and his workers sent to the camps. It was then that he made the decision that would define his life to move the factory and his workers to safety. He approached the authorities with a proposal to establish a new production site closer to the center of the Reich to ensure uninterrupted military supply. His arguments were convincing. The front was approaching, the transportation network was collapsing, and his enterprise would serve the war better if relocated. He succeeded in obtaining permission to open a new factory in Brünnlitz, near his birthplace in Moravia. The most crucial step was to compile the list of workers to be transferred. The list had to be approved by German administration and the SS. For Schindler, it became a weapon, a document of salvation disguised as bureaucracy. About 1,200 people were included: men, women, and children. Each name was selected deliberately, each line written with purpose. Schindler and his accountant Itzhak Stern worked through nights, reviewing records, correcting errors, and adding those who had no official papers. In the language of bureaucracy, it looked ordinary: transfer of production personnel. In reality, it was a rescue operation. The paperwork moved through offices, stamped and approved without suspicion. Schindler used his influence, connections, and remaining fortune to secure approval from Amon Goeth. Accustomed to Schindler's generosity, Goeth signed off without realizing he was authorizing life instead of death. In the autumn of 1944, the evacuation began. The workers were assembled and loaded onto trains. The men were sent directly to Brünnlitz, but the women, through error or design, were diverted to Auschwitz. When Schindler learned of it, he acted immediately. He spent what little remained of his wealth on bribes, gifts, and gold to negotiate their release. Weeks later, the women were freed and arrived at the new factory. It was one of the most dangerous and selfless acts of his life. At Brünnlitz, a new stage began. The factory produced artillery shell casings, but most were deliberately made defective. Schindler knew the war was ending and refused to contribute to its destruction. He continued to provide his workers with food, clothing, and shelter. Far from the front, among the cold hills of Moravia, life slowly returned to those who had lived too long in fear. Every day remained a risk. Inspections came unannounced, and reports had to be submitted regularly. Yet Schindler's confidence and his network of contacts helped him maintain the illusion of compliance. Beneath that facade, he protected what had become his true enterprise, the survival of his people. The list compiled in the summer of 1944 became a symbol. It was not merely a record of names, it was the boundary between life and death. Within it, bureaucracy and compassion merged, and numbers turned back into human beings. By the end of 1944, the war neared its final act. Allied forces advanced toward Berlin, and the Red Army stood at the borders of Czechoslovakia. Schindler understood that soon the Reich would collapse, and all he had created would vanish. But he also knew that more than 1,000 people would live to see that day because of deceit, bribery, and the belief that even one man could change the course of events. During the winter of 1945, the factory in Brunlitz survived on the edge of collapse. The war was nearing its end, yet no one knew when or how it would come. The air carried the constant echo of distant artillery, the smell of smoke, and the silence of uncertainty. In that landscape of destruction, Schindler's factory remained an anomaly, operating but not producing weapons, orderly but humane, German by name but sustained by compassion. The workers saved by the list lived on the factory grounds. They worked in shifts, but production slowed intentionally. The artillery shells leaving the assembly line were often unusable. Inspections occasionally revealed these defects, but Schindler's reputation and his skill in persuasion prevented investigations from going further. Officially, the factory met its quotas. In reality, it contributed nothing to the war. Outside, chaos deepened. Supplies of food and fuel were almost gone, electricity failed frequently, and transportation broke down. Schindler fought daily to secure necessities for his people. He traded his remaining possessions, jewelry, money, and even clothes for food and medicine. He made secret trips to nearby towns, bargaining with local farmers and merchants, still willing to risk contact. The factory became a small world of its own. Families lived in wooden barracks near the workshops. They heated themselves with makeshift stoves, shared bread, wrote fragments of prayers or memories on scraps of paper. This fragile life existed against all logic, sustained only by the will to survive and the strange protection of one man. For the workers, Schindler became more than a director. He was a barrier between them and the chaos outside. He knew that if the authorities ever discovered the fraud, everything would end within hours. Yet, despite the danger, he kept his composure. Discipline, he insisted, was the best defense. His calm presence gave others the strength to endure. By January 1945, the front was close. Radio broadcasts spoke of the Red Army advancing through Poland. German troops passed through Moravia in retreat. Schindler realized that his factory could soon be seized or destroyed. He prepared documents proving its strategic importance and, at the same time, hid several unregistered people under the excuse of maintenance work. Nights in Brunlitz were long and cold. In the barracks, whispers spread about the fall of Budapest and the battles near the Oder. When artillery thundered in the distance, people fell silent, listening. They knew that freedom, if it came, might arrive together with chaos. Schindler rarely left the factory. He spent nights in his office, reviewing papers and maps. The industrialist who once sought profit now produced nothing but hope. His desk was covered not with business plans, but with ration lists and notes on how to keep everyone alive until the end. By February, the Reich was collapsing. Administrative control weakened. Inspectors stopped coming. Schindler used the confusion to his advantage. Reports were no longer sent, but the illusion of production remained. Machines continued to run. Smoke still rose from the chimneys. Symbols of life for those who watched from the barracks. For the workers, this winter became a time of waiting filled with fear, but also with a strange calm. No one knew what awaited them after the war, but they knew that as long as the factory stood and their names remained on the list, life continued. By March 1945, the end was near. The armies were closing in. Schindler prepared for the inevitable moment when German authority would vanish. He did not know what would happen next, but he was determined to stay until the very last day. The winter in Brunlitz became a quiet struggle between despair and endurance. Beyond the walls, the world was collapsing. Inside, against all odds, life persisted, held together by the will of one man who had chosen not to destroy but to protect. April 1945 arrived with a heavy stillness. Germany was collapsing, its army retreating in disarray, and the news of advancing Soviet troops reached even the remote corners of Moravia. In Brunlitz, the tension grew each day. On the roads, columns of weary soldiers moved westward. The sound of artillery rolled across the hills. Everyone on the factory grounds sensed that the fragile order maintained for months was about to break. The workers understood that the final days of the war could be the most dangerous. Rumors spread that retreating SS units were destroying camps and killing prisoners to erase evidence of their crimes. Schindler knew such an order could come for Brunlitz as well. If the authorities decided to liquidate his labor force, no one would be spared. He acted before it was too late. In early April, he gathered and destroyed all documents that could reveal falsified records, employment papers, lists, and correspondence. Only those files proving the factory's military value were kept. He also instructed his workers to prepare shelters and stock food in case of violence. Every precaution was taken silently, without panic. The atmosphere on the factory grounds changed. Machines still operated, but more slowly. Deliveries had stopped, and the last raw materials were nearly gone. People went through the motions of work, aware that production no longer mattered. Each evening, they saw Schindler walking through the halls, checking rooms, revising lists. His presence itself meant safety. On 12 April 1945, he learned that American troops had entered Nuremberg and that Soviet forces were approaching Moravia. It was only a matter of weeks before they would reach Brunlitz. He feared what the retreating Germans might do in desperation. To prevent a massacre, he took a final, bold step. He summoned the factory guards and announced that the enterprise was under his personal responsibility. In case of invasion, he said, no one was to harm the workers. Formally, it was an order for discipline. In truth, it was a command to lay down arms. He distributed food and alcohol among the guards, keeping them calm and loyal long enough for the war to end. By late April, the machines had fallen silent. The workers waited in the barracks, listening to the distant thunder of guns. Each day, Schindler brought fragments of news: the fall of Berlin, the retreat of German divisions. Hope and fear mingled in equal measure. On 7 May 1945, Soviet reconnaissance units reached Brunlitz. The German troops had already fled. The factory stood quiet. No one dared leave the buildings until Schindler himself appeared. He assembled his workers and spoke briefly, his voice tired but steady. The war, he said, was over. There was no cheering, no celebration, only silence. People stood motionless, trying to comprehend that they were alive. After years of fear, freedom arrived not with noise, but with exhaustion. That night, Schindler released the guards, giving them food and money so they would leave peacefully. At dawn, he and his wife left the factory. He knew that if he stayed, he might be arrested as a party member before his actions were understood. He left a letter for his workers, saying simply that he had done only what every person should have done. When Soviet soldiers entered the factory the next morning, they found over 1,000 survivors, men, women, and children, stood among the silent machines that had once been instruments of deception and protection. On the gate still hung the sign Deutsche E-Mail-Warenfabrik, but its meaning had long vanished. Thus ended the story of the factory that became a sanctuary amid destruction. Schindler disappeared into a world of uncertainty, leaving behind those who owed him their lives. They had survived through deception, courage, and the conscience of a man who defied the system he served. His gamble had succeeded against all logic and against the darkest force of his time. When the war ended in May 1945, Oskar Schindler left Brunlitz. He departed with his wife, carrying only a few suitcases and little money. Everything he had once owned was gone, spent on bribes, food, and survival for his workers. To most, he was still a German and a former member of the party, and his new life began not with recognition but with flight. Yet behind him spread the quiet fame of a man who had done what seemed impossible. The factory remained under Soviet control, The people saved by his list slowly dispersed. Some returned to Krakow. Others searched for lost families. Many emigrated to start new lives. For most, the world they had known no longer existed. But the name Schindler became a symbol, proof that even within a system of destruction, a single person could act with humanity. Oskar and his wife Emily hid for a time in the Austrian zone, then crossed into Germany. He tried to start a business again, but nothing succeeded. The country was in ruins, and few cared about a man who had saved Jews. His party membership brought suspicion. His reputation as an industrialist no longer held meaning. He lived on small allowances and occasional donations from those he had rescued. In 1949, he emigrated to Argentina. He tried to run a small farm, raising chickens, but it failed. Money ran out quickly. He lived modestly, often in debt. His marriage suffered under the strain. Emily stayed in South America, while Oskar eventually returned to Germany in the early 1952. There, he lived in poverty, but stories of his wartime actions began to spread. Former workers wrote letters, collected testimonies, and submitted documents about his deeds. Gradually, his name became known. In the 1962, the world began to recognize the scale of what he had done. Invitations and awards followed, along with visits from those who owed him their lives. Yet, Schindler remained modest. He never called himself a hero. He said simply that he had done what anyone should have done. His health declined. He drank heavily, smoked constantly, and lived alone in a small apartment in Frankfurt. Jewish organizations helped him with expenses, and survivors sent him gifts and letters of gratitude. He often spoke about his factory, but rarely about the war. When asked why he had risked so much, he always gave the same quiet answer: because otherwise they would have died. Oskar Schindler died on 9 October 1974 at the age of 66. His body was taken to Jerusalem at the request of those he had saved. He became the only member of the Nazi Party buried on Mount Zion. His gravestone bears inscriptions in German and Hebrew: "Righteous among the nations. Oskar Schindler, who saved more than 1,000 Jews." Visitors come to his grave and leave small stones, a sign of remembrance and gratitude. The factory in Krakow still stands. In the early 21st century, it was turned into a museum dedicated to Schindler's life and the history of the city under occupation. The list he compiled in the summer of 1944 is preserved in archives in Israel, Poland, and the United States. It is more than a historical document. It is a testament that even amid destruction, resistance can exist not through weapons, but through humanity. Schindler's story reminds the world that in an era when obedience was demanded above all, one decision could alter hundreds of destinies. He was not flawless, not saintly, but his actions proved that moral courage can turn deception and bureaucracy into instruments of life. Thus ended the story of a German industrialist no one expected to stand on the side of good. His risk, his forged papers, his quiet defiance, all became the means by which hundreds survived. And in that, his legacy endures, that even in the darkest time, there remains space for one act of humanity to restore the face of the world.